Welcome to Pursuing Environmental Justice Through Science and Religion. My name is Katie Hinman, and I'm the Associate Director of the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, the DOZER program here at AAAS. This session, Pursuing Environmental Justice Through Science and Religion, was born out of the recognition that the impacts of environmental degradation disproportionately affect people of color and marginalized communities. While science can identify issues and even propose steps for mitigation, it primarily falls to local community leaders to take action and lead environmental justice efforts. Communities of faith can be particularly powerful players in this work. So today we'll hear from three people who are involved in identifying and addressing environmental injustice, and then have time of conversation and discussion about these issues. A few words of introduction for our speakers. Dr. Ingrid Waldron is a sociologist and associate professor in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University and the director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, the Enrich Project. She's the author of the book, There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, which was also the basis for a 2020 Netflix documentary. Reverend Dr. Nettie Astadio is a Presbyterian pastor, a Venezuelan American, and co-founder of the Angelic Organics Learning Center, a farm-based educational nonprofit. She teaches eco-theology in diverse settings and currently serves as the director of training and Latino America with Green Faith, Interfaith Partners for the Environment. Ibrahim Abdulmatin is the author of Green Deen, What Islam Teaches About Protecting the Planet, and is co-founder of Green Squash Consulting, which works with people and organizations committed to equity and justice. He has worked with Green for All, Interfaith Leaders for Environmental Justice, and the New York City Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. And our moderator for this session and respondent is Dr. Raj Pandeya. He's the director of the American Geophysical Union's Thriving Earth Exchange, which helps volunteer scientists and community leaders work together to use science to advance community priorities related to sustainability, resilience, disaster risk reduction, and environmental justice. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to take a few minutes to introduce themselves a bit further and say a bit about their work before we delve deeper into conversation. And Dr. Waldron, I'd like to start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. In 2012, the spring of 2012, I was approached by an environmental activist here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, about taking on a project about environmental racism. And I was a bit struck by that because I didn't understand why he was selecting me to do this work. I wasn't an environmental scientist. I didn't know anything about pollutants. So I was very hesitant to say yes. But then I thought about it a bit more and I said to myself, well, this concerns Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia, Black communities, and those were communities I had been working with. It's essentially a health issue, although it's often not articulated that way in the Canadian literature. And I am a health researcher, so that's interesting to me. And as a sociologist, I can bring something special to this in terms of an analysis on race primarily and other intersections like gender and rural living and social class, etc., and colonialism. So I hesitantly said yes to him. And I started the project in 2012 in the fall to do several things. I wanted to look at the social, economic, political, and health effects of environmental racism in Indigenous and Black communities in Nova Scotia, but I wanted to use a multi-method approach to do that. And that multi-method approach has been about sharing knowledge, raising awareness about environmental racism in Nova Scotia and across Canada through a multimedia approach that includes, of course, social media and traditional media and infographics, et cetera, et cetera. It was also about developing key partnerships because certainly there was gaps in my knowledge. So bringing on partners, geologists, hydrogeologists, and other scientists in order to do water testing, for example. It was about, of course, conducting research, but community-based research, research that was engaged research, research that provided communities with an opportunity to lead that research with me. It was also about changing the curricula, changing the high school and middle school curricula in Nova Scotia and making sure that this information is embedded in programs and teaching pedagogy, that teachers are trained to teach this information. And it's also about legislation, trying to get an environmental racism legislation or a bill passed at this stage, a bill passed federally and also provincially. So this has wound up for me to be an incredibly exciting project. I'm so happy I didn't say no to the environmental activist. I've learned a lot. I've recognized that even though there are limitations or gaps in knowledge, that it's essential to partner with diverse people in order to fill those gaps. And what has been the most exciting for me is how interdisciplinary this topic of environmental racism is. When I think about the faculty and the students from different disciplines, different professionals, different sectors who have come to me to support the work over the years, I've recognized over time that the solution, I believe, to environmental racism is interdisciplinary, as the solution is to every problem, that we need to transcend our silos and our boundaries and work together across professions in order to address this issue and any issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waldron. Reverend Dr. Astadio, will you speak a little bit about your work?
Yes, thank you very much. It's great to be with all of you. So yeah, I'm an organizer and an educator and theologian for Green Faith, a multi-faith environmental organization founded after the Earth Summit in 1992. And in our work, we draw from the world's faith and wisdom to solve the ecological crisis, to join with others, and move away from our own silos, and to solve the challenges that we have before us. And we do this through education, convening people of faith from a diversity of religious traditions in the US and around the world, and also working on movement building, providing leadership tools for religious and lay leaders. So I have been spearheading efforts for environmental justice since I was a sociology student back in Venezuela 28 years ago. And this work has led me into an interesting journey from a sociologist to a youth activist to working on marine mammal protection to living with fishing communities, later going to seminary in the US to have the tools to work with faith communities, and moving to an organic farm in Northern Illinois, starting a learning center, to being a Latina pastor, connecting environmental and immigration issues. And then back to seminary to learn more about eco-theology so I could also teach other pastors and seminarians throughout Latin America, and now in Florida as an organizer for Green Faith. And just like I see my own journey trying to figure out how to respond to the environmental crisis, which is pretty much part of my passion and life journey, I also see the faith-based environmental movement alongside increasing environmental issues that we face today, going through a kind of transformation too and development to figure out how we can contribute to heal environmental and climate challenges using our voices and discovering together what gifts we have and can provide to the world today. The good thing I see is, if I see 28 years back, is that there are many more people today getting involved. And we have done this before in the civil rights movement. We know how scriptural teachings made a difference in ending apartheid in South Africa, and notions of nonviolence in the Hindu tradition in India, helping bring down imperial rule and inspire many other people around the globe. In the United States, Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist teacher, a minister, drawing from ancient teachings, inspiring people across racial and economic lines. And today we can think of indigenous leaders in South America and Central America, like Berta Cáceres in Honduras, who led protests against hydro dam projects. And we can think of many named and unnamed leaders. And just like we see in the development of these leaders in their own movement, for many years, environmental organizations focus most of our work on educating people of faith about environmental issues, providing faith-based tools for environmental stewardship, perhaps even trying to convince people of faith that all faith traditions have a spiritual, moral, and ethical calling to care for the earth, to protect the most vulnerable, and pointing to those scriptural passages, sacred writings, stories, and traditions that speak to that truth. But now climate change, loss of biodiversity, pollution, and the fact that we as earthlings ourselves are also suffering. And this is challenging faith communities to do more than just education. And as we look at the systemic issues that fuel our present crisis, we have moved to also working on organizing faith communities, training people of faith on how to organize, how to reach beyond their silos, how to work with others regardless of their race, gender, class, faith tradition, inspired by our common teachings rather than divided by our differences. And so now we are showing up as people of faith in many sectors of society, including UN gatherings on biodiversity, COPs for climate change, and city councils, coalitions, environmental groups. And we're doing this in a multi-faith way, which obviously also means that we need to go through a process of healing relationships among faith communities and lifting up the voices of those who have been marginalized, even by the church, in my case, as a Christian. And one example, with which I just like to end, is the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative that I was blessed to be part of in its beginning, where many religious leaders recognized for the first time ever that indigenous communities are the first and best protectors of rainforests. In some of these countries where the Rainforest Initiative is happening and rainforests still remain, it is because of the stewardship of indigenous communities. And there is one beautiful quote from a Pentecostal pastor in Colombia who said, after hearing about the importance of protecting rainforests, he said, "I'm understanding now that this is not a matter of evangelization, but a survival of the planet." And that statement is powerful, and that is also our new definition of power in the religious environmental movement. We're recognizing that 84% of the world's population recognize themselves as religious or spiritual people. If all of us connect to the teachings of our faith and realize what is happening to the environment, to our lives, and to the threat of future generations, and we all come together to create the changes the world needs today. One tree, one garden, one policy, one green circle, one mosque, one spiritual leader, and one politician at a time, we can accomplish a lot together. So that's part of the work that I do. And thank you for a chance to be with you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Astadio. And now, Ibrahim Abdulmatin, would you tell us about the work that you do?
Great. Peace and blessings. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Bismillah. It's an honor to be here as well, and nice to hear from all of you guys. Ingrid, Nedi, Raj, I'm excited. And Katie, thank you so much for having me. I think for me, the conversation, there's a lot of points of connection, but like many of you, I have personal, emotional, intimate connections to the natural world that anchor this conversation. So I invite you all, as you're going through this conversation, to think of those places and those spaces that mean a lot to you. The vistas, the hilltops, the waterways that resonate for you and your soul. I remember the blackout of 2003 that happened across the Northeast, which really affected 8 states, if I'm not mistaken, and it was a major event. And one of the things that I kept thinking in the middle of that is, what if all of the mosques, what if all the churches, what if all the synagogues had light? What if they, in the midst of this blackout, they actually were true to their mission and their calling, and they were just brilliantly lit? Because not only would that signify what their role should be in our society, if you are a person of faith and you understand that they welcoming people, but also they could physically actually welcome people and have people come there. And then the question was, well, what are the barriers to that vision? And that sort of set me on motion to think through there's a rational arguments for cleaner energy, doing things better than we've ever done before, and to managing waste better than we've ever done before. And there's serious science and serious thinking that's going into improving all of these systems of wastewater management. We have a lot of the tools at our disposal, but there's a lot of barriers. So I got involved in helping to translate some of those barriers. I wrote a book about Islam and the environment because I felt that the faith voice was not really in the conversation. And I really did hold on to that vision, and I still do to this day, of those brilliantly lit houses of worship. And the book was meant as to look at water and waste, energy and food, and understand how we manage those systems in the past, how we manage them in the present, and how we're going to manage them in the future. And to really frame it around people's faith-based understanding of what is our responsibility to manage, and what are the principles within my faith that help sort of push that conversation along. that book and that conversation has gone across the globe, and it's brought me into some very interesting spaces. One space that I just want to share is being in places like Jordan and in other places in the Middle East, discussing with people how to make deserts bloom, how to heal scarred earth, and how to heal land that's been destroyed. And how do we get there when you understand that there's war, and one of the most destructive things on the planet, the most destructive use of technology has been for the use of war and destruction. So we have to address a lot of different issues to move forward. And that's really, this conversation to me is really important. It kind of brings together all those pieces, and I'm excited to be with you all today.
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to turn it over to Raj Pandeya to respond a little bit and then to lead some discussion of this.
So I just want to start by thanking those, thank you, Dr. Waldron, thank you, Dr. Astadio, and thank you, Mr. Abdulmatin. Those were powerful statements. What I took about it was a sort of a coming of full circle, right? We started, Dr. Waldron, you started off talking about the importance of interdisciplinary work and the need to move beyond boundaries and bring together multiple kinds of science, sociology, geology, and then we sort of took it a step further. Nettie, you talked about that faith can be part of that, and even brought in sort of the Christian principles and the Indian principles of nonviolence, and how they add a level of wisdom to this conversation and to the scientific principles. You brought in indigenous leaders and the fact that they're both leading efforts to protest and to protect natural spaces. And there's a lot to be learned there. And then Ibrahim, you kind of brought us back with this lovely vision of houses of worship as places of light, not just in a metaphysical or a metaphorical sense, but in a very literal sense, places of environmental safety, of environmental refuge that people can go to and begin a journey to, I think you said, to help harmed spaces bloom again. And I thought that was a kind of a beautiful vision and a nice tying back to where we started. The other thing I noticed is all of you talked about this as a kind of a personal journey, right? There was a call from someone asking you, would you participate in this? Or there was an opportunity, and you all stepped up to that role of leadership and took on that mantle. And I guess I want to thank you for that. I'd like to explore sort of why you said yes. What made you decide this was the right way to spend your time and your talent? Dr. Waldron, maybe I'll start with you.
I don't know. I saw the challenge in it. What certainly scared me was the fact that there were gaps in my knowledge. This is something that an environmental scientist with an environmental science degree should be doing. But then I saw a challenge in terms of the fact that I didn't know everything and that it was an opportunity to learn something new. I was doing research. I was very content with what I was doing, but there was something a little bit maybe dangerous about this. It felt like I could get into trouble, that I would anger politicians, that I would be challenging something in ways that I hadn't really challenged before. In the past, I was challenging the health system, right? But something about this seemed a little bit more dangerous, and that excited me. So I think it was the excitement of doing something a little off the cuff, the opportunity to learn something new, but also the opportunity to continue doing what I was doing, which was working with Black and Indigenous communities in Canada and in Nova Scotia. I knew that I had to use community-based research methods to do that, because everything that I've learned in my education was that this is a kind of work, or when you're doing work with racialized communities, it should certainly be primarily qualitative, but you need to develop relationships with communities. You need to engage them even before you start the research. That was a bit scary for me as well, because I was a newcomer to Halifax at that time, and just because I'm Black doesn't mean that the Black community in Halifax will take me in or welcome me, right? It's a very, very different community with its own unique history. So I was afraid that I wouldn't be accepted by the Black community. I was an outsider. There's a term for us, and that's called come from a ways. So even if I were here in Halifax for 50 years, I would be a come from away because I'm of Caribbean descent, coming from Toronto. So never really kind of invited in. With the Indigenous community, I'm not part of that community at all. So I had two communities that I felt kind of challenged by in terms of being invited in to share personal stories, but also they were communities I was trying to make inroads in. So that also intrigued me.
I think when I look back, definitely I was raised by two Presbyterian pastors. And when my parents went to seminary, they moved from Venezuela to Argentina. And it was a time of political turmoil and persecution, disappearance, all kinds of things. As a child, I witnessed a church trying to figure out how to respond to the challenges, the social justice issues of the time. And that just was planted in me in a way. And when I was then later back in Venezuela, a teenager, a young woman, also trying to figure out the social issues of my time. That's why I went to university and studied sociology. I became aware of the environmental issues. And I think I was enchanted by nature. I just could never return. I can never look back. I realized that this was my calling. I felt it as a spiritual calling. And then that led me to start working for this environmental organization, to move to the fishing community, then later realized I don't have the tools to work with the communities. I need to go to seminary and then go to seminary and on and on and on. So that's kind of how it began. It's something that just in your heart and you know that you just cannot go look back, and you just need to keep going and doing the work that I do. And it's my vocation, it's my passion. And yeah, thanks.
I mean, for me, it's like this interesting intersection of pieces, right? I've always seen myself as sort of like forgive the actual scientist on this call, but I've always seen myself as like a theoretical scientist. I'm not terribly good at all of the nitty gritty math that you need for physics and all of but I've always seen myself as understanding how systems should relate to each other. And I think I've been worried about the power of science to create technology that then is used to oppress people and also oppress nature and the natural world. That we've used the tools that God has created in the natural world. And I think if Islamically, Muslims have always seen science as the discovery or the investigation of what is in the natural world, right? And really a deep looking at it. So it really has been like, if we take the notion that there is enough here for everyone, that there's enough on the planet Earth for every person, that there's no sense of scarcity. So this notion of scarcity is a myth. And then if you take that idea and then you couple it with your sort of looking at how we've managed the existing resources that we have, it really has been like, well, we can do better than this, right? If there's already like we have everything that we need. So what does that mean? That means we need to work better together. We need to understand better what's in the natural world, and we need to understand how to harness the things that are in nature. When I wrote Green Dean, I ran into this Christian pastor who said, you know, we need to get our energy from heaven versus energy from hell. And what he was saying was taking our energy, not combustion and not things that we pull out of the ground. It's actually sun and wind. But we need to think deeper about how we manage those things. And so for me, it was a deep curiosity. And today that curiosity manifests in like, well, okay, now that we know how to basically do that, well, let's change business models so that people can share the benefit of renewable energy, right? So it's not just one person getting rich, but maybe everybody should be able to share in all these things. And that to me is like the core of it. How do we better share what we have so that everyone can have a baseline? And I think that, you know, Raj, I think that that's like an ongoing curiosity.
How do we share better? I kind of want to build on that, if you don't mind. All of you have talked about working with people who are really different from you. What kind of lessons can you draw from that would help scientists maybe who want to work with a community group that's very different for them, or with a religious community that might be maybe in some ways is a little bit different than a group they've worked with before? What are some great strategies for building strong, trusting relationships across difference?
For me, it's about what I mentioned earlier. I think typically as a scientist or professors, we we develop the research objectives and the questions, and we go in there with everything already developed and prepared without ever consulting the communities, which is why I use a community-based approach, because it means that even before you put in ethics, you put in an ethics submission, you have engaged and started working with and developing partnerships with the community, getting an advisory board together that's composed of key people in the community, providing everyone, the advisory committee members and the community itself, an opportunity to develop the methodology, the questions, the objectives, the ways in which you're going to share knowledge, and making sure that there's equity in terms of power within that research. And of course, we know that as professors, we have power, and we're trying to reduce it. We have to be realistic. We're always going to have that power. We hold a grant. We work in universities, so we can't pretend that that's not the case, but trying to reduce inequities as much as possible, and making sure that you're giving the community an opportunity to work with you throughout the project, from the beginning, before the ethics submission, and towards the end when time comes to share the work. For me, that is the only way to do this work. That's the way to honor and respect the community, but also to understand that there are other ways of knowing, right? As scientists, we are focused on one way of knowing. That's a Euro-Western, Eurocentric way of knowing. But engaging with the community, it tells us that there are other ways of knowing, particularly with the Indigenous community. A term called two-eyed seeing means that you're using both eyes, the Western mode and the Indigenous mode. And similarly with Black communities, there are traditional African Indigenous knowledges that also need to be part of the research. So all of this that I'm discussing here can only happen if you've authentically and organically engaged with the communities that you're focused on, that you're giving them an equal opportunity to be involved throughout the research.
I think one of the things that's really striking to me about that is that we have, right now we're faced, I think 10 years ago when I wrote Green Dean, the conversation was, well, there's an opportunity to clean up the messes we made from the past. And so that there's some possibility for you to come up with really intriguing business models. And people did. They came up with ways to turn plastic back from, back into, material to make clothing out of, which they've done in lots of places around the globe where they're starting to reuse what we have. But I think right now we're facing this crisis together. So I think at some level, it's more of explaining what the scale of the climate shocks look like. And for example, if some of these low-lying places where we live people are going to have to retreat from some of those places. And that retreat stresses people out. It stresses everybody out, policymakers, people who live there, people who own land there. So it's an equally shared stress. Now, the impacts of it and how it manifests down the road won't be equally shared because we haven't dealt with equity like you, Ingrid, like that you just broke down. So I think it's like really just sort of to frame up sea level rise and increased days over 90 degrees and extreme wind events and all of the dynamics of what the real crux of the problem is. That to me should, if we're thinking in a way that's useful, should help to pull us together and to create that language of that translation language that you really just eloquently spoke about. That's going to pull us together in some ways.
I would just add in our experience with Green Faith and working with communities, understanding that well, definitely we had to connect with people and understanding our common concerns. We're all concerned about jobs, about health, about faith, about housing issues. So how do we connect the dots for people, how this relates to the environmental issues that we want people to know about? And building relationships, definitely building relationships is very important and it takes time. So things don't happen quickly, but as we build relationships, we find common ground. And as we reach out to faith communities, then we do know that all our faith communities have a calling to care for each other or care for the natural world. So there are common places where we can meet and advance this type of work.
Raj, if you don't mind, I'll jump in real quick.
Please.
I see a comment from Adria about specific sort of examples, but one of the things this morning I was at the Bronx River Alliance, which is along the Bronx River, and it's along the Sheridan Expressway, which was literally a freeway that had no purpose whatsoever. Like it shouldn't even exist. And so There, people have been slowly trying to figure out ways to dismantle it, and it's a lot harder to do that than you would think. But the Bronx River is very polluted. Well, New York City waterways, there's a lot of science that's going into measuring our water quality, because we want to know what's in our water and we want to improve the water quality. Well, right now, New York City water around it is cleaner than it's been in over 100 years, because we've taken steps gradually to make improvements. Well, part of those improvements is going into those communities and giving them the protocols for how we do the testing. So you have neighborhood residents that live near these waterways that are now going in and getting testing, that using the same protocols that the scientists are using, that the regulators are using, and going in and getting those samples and bringing that to the larger thing. So we have better, we have more samples than ever before. We have more people of all stages in life involved in water quality testing. We have more information about the water quality than ever before. And there's a correlation between that and then the fact that the water quality is cleaner than it's ever been. And I'll add that what they've done is that people are, if you're like people in those neighborhoods, and these are environmental justice neighborhoods that have had manufactured gas plants near there, that have had oil spills and manufacturing all around there, that have been polluted for decades, those communities will surprise you, and they know the nuance of the details. I've seen officials go into those neighborhoods and think, oh, they don't really understand the issues, and for those residents to ask extremely difficult technical questions, and that doesn't come out of nowhere. So I think the first thing when people are kind of understand their relation between making improvements is, don't assume that the local residents don't understand what the dynamics are. They actually do, and they might even know it 10 times better than you. And most likely, there's a grandma that's in there that's been tracking this stuff for years. In particular, in the up north part of the Bronx, there's a woman who literally has, for decades, reads through air quality monitoring reports that the state does. If we don't release those reports, she bothers every elected official all the way up to the governor, and they are nervous about her. So people are ready, and they have the information and they have the knowledge. So don't underestimate and don't assume that they don't have that sophistication.
That's a really powerful reminder of of really taking an asset-based approach, right? Sometimes in science we tend to come in with this idea that people don't know stuff, and in fact people know a lot and care a lot and have a lot to bring to the table, and that's an important reminder. There was a question a little earlier, or a comment a little earlier. Many of us are kind of locked into a Western, industrialized, colonized way of thinking about science and maybe about the natural world as a whole. What would you recommend for somebody who wants to break out of that?
Well, I mean, there are many universities, probably in the United States as well, but in Canada, we are attempting to decolonize the curriculum. Right, so I think a lot of things start with education in our schools, in our high schools, our middle schools, our universities. What does it mean to decolonize the curriculum? It means that you're embedding other ways of knowing from other cultures into the curricula and pedagogy. So it can start there. But the other way that it starts is, once again, developing those relationships with community, understanding that community knowledge is important. When you develop these relationships and you get to know the community and you have these partnerships and you are commiserating with community members, you learn just by osmosis their ways of knowing, their cultures. And to me, that is the best way, the most authentic way to challenge kind of normative ideologies about science, about the collection of data, about ethics. All of these issues are really important in terms of just ethical implications of the research that you're doing, how you're engaging people, how you're collecting the data, how you're analyzing the data, how you're sharing knowledge, how you're building those partnerships. That's community knowledge, and it comes from relationships, and it also comes from education. In the universities, it's probably about challenging your professors as well. That's very difficult for students to do. But if you're not in a university that's in the process of decolonizing the curricula, as we say, then it's important to challenge the head of your department to see how you can embed diversity, EDI, or culturally different knowledges within the program and curricula. We're currently doing that in my faculty. In the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie, we're going through curricular change. And that's coming from some of us, that's coming from students, and that's coming from faculty, where we're completely changing the curricula and making sure that we are challenging normative and Euro-Western notions about communities.
The thing that we like to tell people of faith is that 85% of people of faith usually say that they have had spiritual experiences in nature. But normally, when you want to go back to church and share those experiences, the church doesn't necessarily, I'm talking church because I'm a Christian, provide the tools to figure out how to interpret that experience. And so we tell people, don't deny those experiences. And one of the things that I like to tell when I teach seminarians about ecotheology is the fact that during the first 1500 years of history of the Christian church, the role of the theologian, in a way, our own type of faith scientist, did include understanding and studying and relating to the mysteries of God in nature, to gain wisdom, not just for ourselves, but or for a few, but for the common good. And so we need to recognize that this was part of the history of our church, and we need to rescue that. What happened, unfortunately, is that when the rise of the scientific revolution and with these new discoveries, like the one that said that we're not the center of the universe and the sun did not rotate around the earth, and all the hierarchies the church had and society had created, the church just didn't know what to do with the new knowledge, and there was just too much at stake, unfortunately. And instead of asking for forgiveness for teaching wrong doctrine and praying to Christ for help, the church decided to just get rid of the nature and leaving nature in the hands of science and modernity and the industrial revolution, and then to the market. And the role of the theologian became to figure out the mysteries of God now only in scripture. So we like to tell people that that's part of our history, and therefore there's things that we can rescue. So our experiences today can be dignified and also connected to our spirituality, which is powerful for many of us. In spite of the crisis, we know that we had to continue forward because this is part of our faith. So that's what we like to tell people.
I'm sorry, I just want to add into that. It's just that, Danny, that was beautiful. And Ingrid, those things just really hit me in the heart. I think you just sort of summed up like centuries of history there. And I think that the astonishing part about is that people always talk about, why did the Muslim world, which was leading in the scientific sort of discovery for centuries, what happened and why did it fall off in sort of its like in innovation? And one of the things was that Muslim theologians were observing what was happening with the Enlightenment and making this assumption that most of the scientific discoveries were being used to draw people away from God. And that those uses of technology, so that they sort of pushed back against it and stopped and said, well, maybe technology and science as we understand it, maybe we should slow down because it should be used to bring you closer to God. And that to me is a really interesting, there's some work that needs to be done comparing and thinking about those two connections and about that historical work, just and I think what we have now is the opportunity to kind of heal that. In the sign, we say that when you look into nature, you're looking at the signs of God, and then when you're in the ayats, what we call, or like ayats or sections of the Quran, you can be walking in nature. The term ayat is also a sign in nature. So you're like in nature, you're reading the Quran. In nature, you're reading scripture. And part of that speaks to the Islamic orientation, is that you're not worried about the origin of things. So I think going back to this idea of like, you're not worrying about where did the universe come from and what is the source of everything. That's like, you're not interested in that conversation. It's more like, how do these things work, and how do we work with these things in nature? And really maybe the orientation should be, how can I be a better gardener and cultivator of the natural world? And to be the best gardener and cultivator of the natural world, I have to understand its actual components and how it relates to everything else. And perhaps we could chart a course as people of faith, and also people and just with science, of looking at the natural world as something to work with instead of working against.
So this is exciting. Like what I'm taking away from this is that there's a kind of brokenness where science, nature, and religion have sort of been decoupled, or even used to decouple from each other. And part of the healing process is maybe letting go of some of the metaphysical questions and just getting together and doing the work, the hard work of reconnecting of solving problems, real problems, of charting of sort of an equitable future forward together. We only have like a minute left, and so two questions for you. We actually have 2 minutes left. So two questions for you, and you can take either one. One question is sort of, what can a science society do to start to bring and foster these kinds of connections? Or what can an individual scientist do to connect with a religious community?
I'll just jump in, is that I think, to Ingrid's point and to Nedi's point about relationship and about community, I think that perhaps one of the biggest first things would just be to reconnect and not necessarily have an agenda, but reconnect and have the agenda be, let's have be in better relationship to each other. And perhaps that there is a larger religious society or organization that may not intentionally be environmental in its scope, or even scientific oriented in its scope, but maybe there's just some sort of a shared connecting or just participating in each other's convenings, and maybe building over time, just sort of starting to make those connections, just to begin that relationship building.
It's just being present together. Eddie or Ingrid, do you want to add? And then I'm going to hand it back to Katie to close us out.
Nedi, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, I would encourage scientists to challenge faith communities to work together, to realize that faith communities have a say, an important say. We know that half of the emissions that are in the atmosphere in the last 20 have been put there in the last 20 years. So in spite of the fact that we have the best technologies already available to us, so definitely there's a role for faith communities, for the moral and the ethical and spiritual values to help us in the crisis that we're all together in. So challenge us, and we look forward to support you in that.
Got it. Invite in the kind of the expertise and the perspectives. Ingrid?
Well, I'm currently leading a national anti-environmental racism coalition across Canada. I wouldn't say I reached out necessarily to faith-based organizations. I reached out to organizations that are interested in doing work in the climate sector and environmental justice, and a lot of faith-based organizations signed on. So I guess I would say, don't discount or dismiss the fact that actually faith-based organizations would want to be involved in science or environmental justice. I mean, I wasn't really thinking about them when I formed this coalition, but I was surprised to find out that they wanted to be involved. So I would say, don't dismiss anybody. Don't assume that people are not interested in being involved. You might be surprised. And the other thing about faith is, when in working with the Indigenous community, it's also about recognizing that people have different understandings of the world. We know with Indigenous communities and also with Black communities that there's a bit of there's a holism in terms of their thinking. We tend to separate things in your Western culture, but they see the land as connected to the animals, as connected to people, as connected to the plants, right? So there's a holistic understanding of the world, and consequently about how environmental issues, environmental racism should be addressed. So I think in engaging faith-based communities, also recognizing that people have different understandings of the world and the connections between different elements of our world.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I wish we had more time. Thank you for the work you do, and thank you for sharing that work with us. Also, for everybody who kind of participated in the discussion, thank you for all your great questions. Thanks for kind of steering the discussion. And Katie, I think back to you.
Sorry, thank you, Raj.
Yeah, you did a fantastic job. It was really amazing.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been an incredibly powerful session, and just really wonderful to hear about the work that you're doing and to share some ideas about how we can continue to move forward in environmental justice work. I would invite folks to, just a reminder, to check out the DOZER program. The sciencereligion.dialogue.org website has a lot of great resources on it. And we would love to get involved with you more. Thank you again to everyone who participated in this workshop, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the AAAS annual meeting.